Hello everyone and welcome to today's National Soil Survey Center webinar. My name is Sean McVeigh, National Training Coordinator for the Soil Science Division and host for today's webinar, Digital Soil Mapping in Practice, Essex County, Vermont Initial Soil Survey, the first officially correlated and published NRCS raster soil survey. This webinar is being recorded and all participants join the webinar in listen-only mode. You receive the webinar audio through your device's speakers. There is no telephone dial-in. If you're having audio difficulties, please check the various ways your computer speakers may be muted or have their volume set low, including the speaker adjustments available in the Adobe Connect interface. You can maximize your webinar experience in Adobe Connect by shutting down VPN and any other programs that might compete for bandwidth. This includes email and Microsoft Outlook and instant messaging in Skype. Taking a look at our webinar room layout, Adobe Connect has content pods that include the feature presentation, chat, and Q&A pods. Use the 4-arrow icon in the featured presentation pod to enter and exit the full screen view as you choose. To submit a comment or question for me or our presenter, use the Q&A pod and type in your question. I'll handle technical difficulties the best I can while hosting the webinar and interact with our presenter to answer your questions during the verbal Q&A period. I want to thank Jessica Phillip for being here to support our digital soil mapping series of webinars. And Jessica, I'm going to turn the webinar over to you so you can start the topic.
All right. Thanks, Sean. Hi, everybody. I am here today to talk about digital soil mapping in practice. So I guess I'll just jump right in. Basically, what we're doing here is learning about an actual example of a digital soil mapping project. And it's an early example of a production soil survey that uses DSM. And I'll say up front that the methods weren't necessarily perfect, but we were kind of figuring it out as we went. And, you know, the important thing is that we had a team of soil scientists that was really committed to finding a new way to make better soil maps. So just a little rundown of what we were working with. It was started in about 2004 and ended up being, the raster soil survey portion of this ended up being published on the Geospatial Data Gateway in 2014, which is actually, I think, 3 full years after it was finished. But it did end up being the first officially, NRCS officially published raster soil survey in the nation. And it was an initial survey that resulted in both a raster soil survey and a Sirgo product. And I'm going to focus on the raster side of things. We will touch on the Sirgo part today, but you know, this is really about the raster side and focusing on the DSM part of it. The key point here is that it was completed by actual field soil scientists in what is now the 12 STJ MLRA Soil Survey Office in St. John's, Vermont. We're part of Region 12, and Essex County was 430,000 acres, and it was the last survey area in Vermont to be completed. And there were 4 soil scientists. You see them on the right there. That's Roger Duquette, Tom Burke, Bob Long, and myself. And it took us about 5 years to do, but that was after 3 years of software development and concept validation. You know, this was a whole new process. And really none of this would have been possible without the help of a partnership that we have with Dr. Shrinshi out of Dartmouth, and we actually still have that partnership going. So we're still in regular contact with him, and he's part of what keeps SIE, which you'll hear about in a second, going. Those people on the right, we're down to 2 of us now. There's been a couple retirements, but we're still a good office that's committed to doing stuff in this new way. So who am I? You know, I listen to a lot of these webinars, and I often wonder, like, why I should trust the person that's talking. So just a little bit about me. I've been doing this for 14 years. I actually started out as a soil conservationist, but I rapidly realized that I'd really rather focus on the soil side of things and came over to soil science while I was still a student. And when I started in soils, ArcSIE, which is the software that we use to do digital soil mapping, was just coming into existence. And so I have really spent the last 14 years figuring that out and becoming, you know, the expert in using that. And to be honest, I have never actually had to knock on any doors or use a stereoscope other than when my boss made me prove that I could. So that makes me a little bit different from a lot of traditional soil mappers, but I promise that I have actually dug a lot of holes, and you'll see more evidence of that today. So I'm just going to do a brief overview of digital soil mapping in case you weren't able to tune into the little DSM primer that we had a few weeks ago, or if you just forgot and really want to know. So basically, digital soil mapping has a couple definitions. The spatial prediction of soil classes or properties from point data using a statistical algorithm is kind of the basic way of looking at it. And then there's also this definition from McBratney about it being the generation of geographically referenced soil databases based on quantitative relationships between spatially explicit environmental data and measurements made in the field and laboratory. And the key word there is quantitative relationships. And you know, that's what's different from traditional soil mapping, is really being able to you know, back up our decisions about where soils get mapped and quantify them and make them reproducible. So the big difference, one of the big differences between conventional and digital soil mapping is that in conventional mapping, you know, we're drawing lines and polygons, and we're out there in the field looking for where things change from one soil to another soil. So we're focusing on where the boundary is between two soils. And that means we spend a lot of time in the marginal areas. But with DSM, we're talking about defining the central concept and really nailing those down. And then the variation between soils kind of naturally grades into each other across the landscape. So the specific kind of digital soil mapping that I'm talking about that we use for Essex County is called knowledge-based digital soil mapping. And broadly speaking, what that means is that the training data that goes into the predictive modeling thing is expert knowledge, and that is not limited to, but it can include point data. So some other DSM methods are strictly kind of machine learning and require a lot of point data going into them. And while this knowledge-based process can use point data, the strength of it is that it doesn't require a whole lot of it. What it does require is soil scientists who know what they're talking about. So knowledge-based digital soil mapping has really a singular purpose, and that is to extract the soil landscape model that lives in an experienced soil scientist's head and turn it into something that's consistent and reproducible. So, you know, we all, as soil scientists, know when we're walking around outside, we have an idea of where certain types of soil occur and, you know, how they interact with each other and how the, you know, soil forming factors are influencing what occurs where. But all of that, and all of that is actually kind of inherent in a Sirgo map, but it's not well documented. It's not easily reproducible. As you know, you can look at a soil map that was made by one person and a soil map made by another person, and you can see just differences in mapping styles or whatever. And so DSM really tries to minimize that issue and make things reproducible and consistent. And we feel that we did a really good job of that with Essex County. So for us, what that meant was using the software that you see right in the middle. I'll show you a little bit of that today. And it's called the Soil Inference Engine. It's a ArcGIS extension. And basically, you have to think about, you know, you're trying to get the computer to see what you're seeing. And that's a challenge because our brains are just able to process the whole world at once, basically. And whereas the computer is looking kind of pixel by pixel and tiny little data point by tiny little data point. And so we have to figure out how to reproduce our own soil landscape model that's in our head and make it something that the computer can actually read. And for us, again, the main tool in our toolbox is called ArcSIE. And that is the software that we helped develop with Dr. Shi at Dartmouth. And it is, you know, the main tool in our toolbox because it does quite a few different things, and that includes terrain derivatives, and those are the main ways that we predict soils here in the Northeast. We get our digital elevation model from LIDAR, and that is what we use to tell us all about slope and curvature and all that, and that's what a terrain derivative is. And we use that just kind of to help us visualize things, but also as input into a soil model. And that's what soil inference is. That's us, inferring where certain soils occur based on the things that these terrain derivatives are telling us. And then it also does a bunch of post-processing, which I'll touch on. I'm going to touch on all of these in the presentation. I see somebody has an echo problem. I'm sorry. I don't have anything going on here with my sound, so hopefully it's okay for most people. And then it also does vectorization, so that's how you can turn that into a Sirgo product. The big thing here is that ArcSIE was designed for field soil scientists to implement knowledge-based raster soil mapping. The idea was that it's the soil scientists that know about the soil formative environment, and we want to be able to take, utilize that and have it be the soil scientists who are actually doing the modeling work too. I mean, we want to know that we're really doing justice to the expertise that we actually have out in the field. So back to Essex County, let's give you a little bit of context here. Where in the world is it? It is in the far northeast corner of Vermont, which is in the northeast corner of the country. It borders Canada and New Hampshire. It's about 430,000 acres, and it's part of MLRA 143. And like I said before, it was an initial soil survey. This is what it looks like. The typical landscape is pretty much wooded, 90% wooded, which actually means that for the most part it was one landowner, a timber company. That's why I didn't have to knock on doors my early years. And it's mainly glaciated hills and mountains with narrow valleys, elevation about 1,000 to 3,000 feet, mostly loamy Wisconsin age till, and forestry and recreation are the main land uses. And there was very poor access for the Northeast anyway. I know this is nothing for out west when you're talking about acreage and roads, but for us, this power line was literally our main north-south highway for the project. And then the other thing is that there was very little existing field data. But we did have a couple of soil scientists. Two of the guys that worked on this had been working in the area for 20 plus years, and were very confident that they did know the landforms and what kind of soils were occurring where. The major landforms in Essex County, the easy stuff here was shallow soils on upper hill slope positions and mountains in the background, and then deeper soils formed in dense till on the foot slopes in the foreground. And it's these dense till soils that we focused our ArcSIE efforts on, and they're what I'm going to be focusing most on today. But we did use similar approaches for ablation till and some of the bedrock controlled areas. And there's also other parent materials. In Essex, the outwash, alluvial, and the cushion soils are not traditionally, but done digitally, and organic soils were heads-up digitized. So as we've moved forward from this project, we're doing things a little differently, but just, again, this is the Essex story, so just so you know, some of the county was mapped traditionally. So the actual, now that you know the setting of Essex County, let's get into the actual steps of a digital soil mapping project, or at least a knowledge-based one. All of these steps, I'm going to touch on all of these, but if you're really, really interested in the how and the details, we do have a class that's part of a DSM training sequence that walks you through all of this and exactly how to do it. But I will scratch the surface on all of it today. And the important point here is that all of this was done in-house. This was a soil survey office that did all of this. A lot of it we figured out on our own, and we still do it that way. We still do all of this work in-house. So the basic steps are data processing. You get your LiDAR data or whatever you get and have to process it. Then we stratify the landscape. Then we move into modeling, which includes, for a knowledge-based model process, that includes extracting the knowledge, selecting environmental layers, and running soil inference, and then verifying out in the field that what you've done actually makes sense. And then those two steps, the modeling and field verification, are actually iterative. We adjust the model based on what we find out in the field up to a certain point. And then, once it's good, you kind of call it good and start doing some post-processing and get to the point of correlation and publication, which includes kind of accuracy assessment type things, which were not well developed in Essex County, I'll say now. And then publication, also including NASA's population and all that. So this, even though it was a raster survey, it did end up fitting into the boxes that we had for the traditional for traditional Sirgo type products. So the first step, data processing, LiDAR or otherwise, and I'm talking about this because we have found through working with other offices that are getting going on DSM projects that it is vastly underestimated how much time is needed for data processing just leading up to a project. And again, for us, this was all done in-house, and it was at the beginning of getting LiDAR. We got some LiDAR back in 2005, and it was really just us kind of floundering around trying to figure out what to do with it. I know now a lot of offices have GIS specialists at the regional level that might take care of some of this for you, but we didn't have that, and which was actually kind of cool. It made it so that we could focus on, or I don't know, I guess maybe I just like doing this stuff, so I was able to, figure out LiDAR and make it something that we were all really familiar with, which is really fun. And a reminder, in the case of Essex, we actually had a couple of years at the beginning of this project where we did not have any acreage goals, and so that was instrumental in helping us be able to take the time to figure it out. And that was not just the LiDAR processing, but it was the whole, software updates and all that. We could talk a little more about that later if you guys want to. But really, we had a couple years at the beginning where there wasn't a lot of pressure. We knew that we were going to have to show results, but it was like, let's get this right from the get-go kind of thing, which was really nice. So the data processing for our LiDAR for Essex included reprojecting. We got the data in tiny little tiles that needed to be reprojected, mosaic together into something workable, clipping the digital elevation model to the work areas, and filling no data areas, shading spikes off of it, and smoothing and resampling it. And so all of these, I'm not going to go into how we do all of those things, but that's just to give you an idea. All of this had to be done before we could even start thinking about actually doing a soil modeling project. And that's still the case today. Again, someone else might take care of it for you if you're lucky, but this is all part of what needs to happen. And there are no clear guidelines of exactly how you should do that, because all data is a little bit different. So that's just sort of a fair warning on doing this type of work. But what do we do with that LiDAR data? The first thing that we do is landscape stratification. So we stratify the mapping area by parent material or landform, and this is what provides the basis for all the subsequent soil mapping. So in Essex County, we used different models or approaches within each parent material type. Like I mentioned before, this is focused on the lodgement till portion of soils, but we did, we were able to use the LiDAR. You can really clearly, let me get that little arrow here. Let's see. So, all right, looks like it's working, but then it's not. Regardless, on the left-hand side, you can see those really striated areas. That's shallow to bedrock. and in the sort of smooth areas in between that, you've got dense till. And those are just some super clear signatures that we were able to learn from the LiDAR pretty quick. And there's signatures for all kinds of different parent materials, and we spent a lot of time manually delineating the differences between the parent materials. And there are certainly possibilities for automated techniques of doing this. One of the requirements to make an automated technique work is letting go of a little bit of control of the map in terms of what I think soil scientists are used to controlling when it comes to making sure the lines are exactly where they should be. So for Essex, we decided that was very, very important because the way that soils behave within different parent materials needs to be separated out. And it was a large amount of time, but it was definitely worth it. So since that parent material mapping was done manually, we did incorporate an extensive peer review process, and basically, we divided up our mapping area each year among the soil scientists that were working in the office, and we went out in the field and figured out what parent material was where. The first step actually happened in the winter, where we were just looking at the LiDAR and drawing lines how we thought the parent materials were. And then we would sit down and do a group peer review, identifying areas that need field checking. And then we would spend the first half of the summer kind of going out and checking all those areas and really making sure that we were confident in our parent material breaks. And then each soil scientist then goes out in the field back to their respective areas and edits the parent material based on what they find. And then we actually switched. We did all this digitally, of course, so we had our own geodatabases. We would switch them and then make edits to each other's, and then we would all sit down as a group again and kind of decide which lines were right and decide if there's any other further field work that needs to be done. And so we would do group peer review then and final edits, and then we would kind of certify it to say, all right, these parent material lines are good, let's move on to the modeling process. And this was time consuming, and it was something that we did on a kind of a cycle, as we moved through the county chunk by chunk, we would do this. But it did, I think, set us up for success when it came to the modeling within each type of parent material. So that, just to really make the point that fieldwork is still crucial to this process, even just at this beginning level. This just the parent material delineations. I would say most of our field work was actually focused around this parent material stuff. But the key is that once those relationships are well understood, more time can be spent in other areas. So you can see in the upper right-hand corner of that map, you've got a whole lot of waypoints, and that was because it's sort of a messy area, and we had to figure it out. But on the lower left, it's pretty clear, dense till and some ablation till, and we just, once we were confident in those signatures, then we were able to move on and trust each other that we were making the right call on those lines. But any field points you do have really help, back up your decision during the peer review process. So once we've done that, once we have our map broken out into parent materials, the next thing is to start modeling. And what does that mean? For us, that means translating knowledge into a rule. And, we all, soil scientists all know all kinds of things about the soils and where they occur. And, this is just one example of that. Like, you might know that a certain soil tends to occur at certain elevations. So if you know that soil A occurs between 200 and 600 meters, you can confidently say that between those elevations, we expect to find soil A. But the thing is that for almost everything, as you deviate from those values, it doesn't all of a sudden mean you're never going to find that soil. So part of what knowledge-based curve mapping does is allow you to gradually taper off that definition of where the soil occurs. So what we're doing is taking what we know about a soil, which is really what we know about the soil formative environment and how the soil forming factors affect where you expect to find the soil, and you're defining that typical area, but you're also allowing for it to come in as you move away. You know, as you get elevations higher than 600 meters, you're going to find soil that's less and less like your target soil. But it doesn't mean it's going to be totally something different as soon as you hit 600 meters. So that's kind of just the general rule. This is just a general example, but if you think about it and you think about everything you know about a soil, you have all these rules in your head. You know, when you're looking around, you're saying, oh yeah, you know, when I see a slope like that at that aspect, then I'm pretty sure that I'm going to find such and such a soil. And so this is simply documenting that and making it so that the computer is thinking the same thing, basically. And just remember this little graphic that for the raster mapping process, we're trying to define the central concept of the target classes. And in order to do that, you need to know what our target classes are, what those central concepts are. So for Essex County, for the lodgement till Katina, we targeted 3 soil series. We targeted 3 soil series for our central concepts, and that was Cabot, which is at the poorly drained member of the Katina, and the Kernel, which is somewhat poorly drained, and Dixfield, which is actually now Peru, and that's moderately well drained, and that's as dry as it gets for our basal till Katina. And again, you know, you need to know your target class to be able to define it. And for Essex, we based it around these soil series, but it doesn't have to be soil series. And the other important point, excuse me, is that these, of course, were not the only 3 soils that we found out there when we were digging holes, but these did help us represent the whole Katina of lodgement till soils. So the actual soil class that's represented by the data at the end of the process generally encompasses a broader range than what is traditionally thought of as a series-based soil component. Again, it doesn't have to be a series concept that's used for the central concept, but for us, the classes, in our case, really end up being more about landform or terrain positions, but since soils are the language that we speak, that's what we use to make the definitions. So again, in the model, the soil formative environment is what's targeted as the central concept, but the actual soil class really ends up spanning more than one series concept, and that's borne out through field verification. And with proper documentation anyway, it really better represents the soil continuum. So what you're looking at here is the kind of horizontal blue and reddish boxes are 2 of the soil classes that end up being modeled, and you'll see what those look like in a minute. And then overlaid by the actual series-based components and, you know, the definition of each of those series and how they occur. So you can see that, for example, Wilmington right there in the middle, it occurs in both of those soil classes, and that's okay. It's kind of, it's on the wet end, or it's on the dry end of the wet class, and then it starts to, it's on the wet end of the middle class drainage-wise, and it just kind of occurs on too many different landscape positions for us to make it its own class. But we recognize that it's out there, it's in the documentation, and the points that include Wilmington data are also used, as you'll see later, in our kind of data population for information about each of these soil classes. So how do we kind of extract that knowledge? You know, how do we come up with all those rules that make those soil classes? Really, once you know your target, you start pulling together everything that you know about those targets. For us, that was the Cabot Kernel Dixfield soils. You document it all, even though you don't know that exactly what's going to be important into the actual mapping process. But for us, we took, there's a block diagram. Again, we knew, even though there wasn't mapping, there wasn't much mapping in Essex County at all, and very, very little point data, we were familiar with the landforms, and we knew in general what a block diagram would look like. So just sketching something like that out helped. And then just, we had spreadsheets of everything we knew about the soil. We took notes on landform and hill slope position and elevation and slope and aspect and vegetation, anything that we could think of. And we kind of filled in those boxes for all of our target soils. And that's what we use to build the model, because we tie all of that information into, that information about the soil formative environment, we tie it to environmental data layers. So again, this is where the computer is starting to be able to see what we see. If you select digital layers that represent the documented soil landscape model, then that's how you're able to have those curves make sense. And in the case of Essex County, slope, a 30-meter neighborhood, and something called the multi-path smooth wetness index were both very important. In Essex, we focused on terrain-based data layers, but this process is certainly not limited to that. There are a lot of spectral possibilities, especially out west, that's used a lot more. But for us, this happened to work. So that's nice and simple for us, I guess. But it wasn't without a lot of trial that we arrived at using just the slope and wetness index. So we actually evaluated a lot of data layers, and this is just a couple examples. But like I said, we didn't know when we were first gathering everything, gathering all our knowledge up, we didn't know exactly which bits of information were actually going to be super helpful. So we looked at a lot of things that we thought might help the computer see the soil distribution. And we discounted many of them for various reasons, either because, well, these two are good examples, because the landform mapping, it seemed like that would make a lot of sense. Of course, our soil, if we focus on terrain-based soil modeling, you would think a landform map would be really helpful, and it could be. But in Essex County, it was overly simplistic and inconsistent when it came to, again, we're trying to consistently map certain soils, so consistency is a huge thing that we were looking for. And then relative position, which we tried multiple resolutions of, or neighborhoods, also didn't consistently add value to the model. It certainly told us some things, but it didn't necessarily tell us anything more than those other data layers were telling us. So we looked at a lot of possibilities. We also looked at various vegetation maps and all that. And in the end, we kept it to slope and wetness index for the whole model for the lodgement till, which is pretty cool. It's really, really simple, but it worked. That's the key. We tried very hard not to make it more complicated than it needed to be. So this is an actual rule that came out of Essex County. This is what it looks like. I'm not going to go into the software and which buttons you push and everything. But we load those environmental data layers into the software and then create rules about them, and that's how we map soils. So what this rule is telling you, just in case you're staring at it and wondering, is this is the wetness index rule for Cabot soil, which, if you'll remember, is the wet side of the Katina. So what this rule is saying is that pixels with a wetness index value of 6.3 or above are assigned a full membership into the Cabot class. And at a wetness index value of 4.8, as you can see, that's halfway down the green curve there, then membership in the Cabot class is 0.5. So I'm talking about membership. What does that mean? Again, I'm just going to touch on this, but it means, we're talking about fuzzy membership, and the higher the fuzzy membership, which they go from 0 to 1, then the more similar to the target soil series or the target central concept that pixel would be. So basically what we're trying to do is map high membership in places where we expect to find that soil, and low memberships where you wouldn't have that soil. hopefully that makes enough sense to move forward here. This is what comes out of each, for each soil class after you build all the rules, after you take everything you know about that soil and define rules and build them. This is what comes out. This is a fuzzy raster map. And again, the fuzzy membership values of each pixel represent the similarity of that pixel location to the typical soil formative environment defined by the curves. And this just happens to be results for Cabot. So that rule that you just saw is part of what makes this map come out. And you can see that the darker areas are high membership. And that's where we would expect the wet side of the Katina. It's in the kind of lower, flatter areas. And you can see there's kind of some drainage ways going in there. So this makes sense. We do evaluate the fuzzy results based on field data. I will say that we didn't spend a lot of time field verifying with the individual fuzzy maps, but we did have, by this time we did have a fair amount of field data that we had gathered through the parent material mapping process that allowed us to at least look at these and evaluate them and say, yeah, we're seeing high memberships where we expect to see high memberships, and nothing looks too totally weird. But the next step is to actually bring all those together. So you have fuzzy results from each soil class that get hardened together so that each pixel in the survey is assigned to the soil class that has the highest fuzzy membership. And that, once you have fuzzy memberships that you're kind of happy with, this is the next step, because you have to combine them all into one map. So every pixel needs to be assigned one soil class, and this is how we do it. There may be other ways, but this is exactly, those three on the left are real examples from Essex County. They come together to form, again, we had three central concepts that we were working on modeling that actually kind of told the story of the whole Katina. And so at this stage that we did a whole lot of field verification. So this was sort of the early stages of tough books. We were able to get a tough book with Bluetooth, and we were able to go out and really see how well that digital elevation data that we got from LiDAR was able to differentiate just the tiny little details of the landscape, which was really fun. Just looking at this, I can see that it's, the thing on the screen is an early version of a hardened map. But, we spent a lot of time verifying the model at this stage, because these three hardened classes are what end up making up the map unit for the later part of the process. And again, it was an iterative process. We would go out in the field, dig a bunch of holes, and then we would potentially, anyway, edit the model until we were happy with it, and then go back out and test it again. I have no idea how many iterations we did. It was a lot in Essex. Part of it for us was figuring out just the whole process. Does this process make sense, let alone are our results good? So I'm sure we did more iterations than is usually reasonable, but for us it worked out. By the end of the survey, we had collected 9,041 georeference points, and just over 400 of those, I think about 425, were full or almost full pet-on descriptions. But the rules of the game were that if you dig a hole and you actually put a series name on them, you had to have collected enough data to make the call. You can't just say, oh, that was Cabot, without explaining why you thought it was Cabot. But this is what the distribution of points looks like. You can see kind of a mass in the sort of northern third. That's where our initial testing was done. There's a couple papers on this and everything, and we had a couple of study areas. Then there's another mass sort of south of that. That's where I did my master's thesis on testing the transferability of a model like this. So then the results, again, on the left, you only have three soil classes, but in the end, we know that there's not just three different soils out there. It's really quite a few more. So the next thing that we did was integrate slope phase and I know there's a whole debate about doing this with digital soil map products, but for Essex we did. We used a 60-meter slope neighborhood that we had tested out in the field to see if that best represented what a soil scientist would, how a soil scientist sees slope. And on the right, I have it all color-coded to maintain those classes, but the first digit represents the soil class from the model. So the ones that start with 1 are centered around the Cabot concept. The ones that start with 2 are centered around the kernel concept, and the ones that start with 3 are centered around the Dixfield or Peru concept. And then the second digit is slope phase. And excuse me, those are standardized slope phases, 0 to 8, 8 to 15, 15 to 35, 35 to 60. And it is actually the stage on the right that ended up, that ultimately was published as the Raster Soil Survey, with a few tweaks to it. But basically what you're looking at on the right is what ended up being published. When I say that there was a little bit of tweaking done, part of it in terms of publishing the raster, part of it came from doing this Raster Glass concept validation. So, we took all of those points that you saw throughout the whole county, and we used those to determine if there were any, too much class overlap and if anything needed to be combined. A couple of them were for the raster. But in the end, the raster class concepts were validated using a subset of those points. 187 of the well-documented field samples were used. And the ranges and the RVs that were populated in NRCS actually came from this aggregated field data. So you can see just at the bottom, it's just a couple of examples of the basic stats that you can run in ArcGIS on things that were collected at each of these. Depth to redox features and depth to bedrock, I think that is, were both important, or maybe it was depth to stensic, I just can't see. But anyway, it was, those things were collected for all of these points, and those are part of what's important to differentiate the soil classes from each other. And so again, the aggregated data from these 187 points were used to populate the database. A raster soil component is spatially represented by a single pixel, and a raster soil map unit comprises the entire population of each raster soil component. And component tabular data is correlated to each pixel value, but the DMU contains only one component. So the population is based on the aggregated field data, like I said at the last slide. So what we did, in the end, some of the constraints of field or the traditional model meant that we did tie each raster class to the closest soil series-based component in the database, but the actual DMU is based on aggregated data, and each of those raster classes ends up being a single component that has a range that's broader than one series-based component. Think back to that kind of graphic I had that with the two SIE classes overlaid by the soil series. It's those classes that are represented in the DMU. And this is what the map product looks like. You might have seen this specific graphic in various publications, but this is what it looks like. This is, a really detailed, well-documented representation of where the different soil classes occur on the landscape, and we're very confident in them. So that's pretty fun. You can see, they are named traditionally, aside from, they don't have a soil series name as part of the name. It's more of a connotative, the 1-2 and the 3-2 and all that is part of what makes up the name. The raster product is delivered using a filed geodatabase format modeled after Sirgo. It took I'm not going to lie, it took a really long time to figure out how to deliver this stuff. There has been kind of a lot of resistance to delivering raster data, basically based around not having a good platform to do so, because Web Soil Survey wasn't ready for it yet. but that's why it's on the gateway, and just the organization of it was modeled after Sirgo. And because of that, you can access interpretations just like you can with that stuff. Once you do a little bit of table joining, you can select pixels that meet a certain interpretive requirement. All the familiar tables and everything are still there. So the Raster Soil Survey is available for a subset of the Essex County Soil Survey area. If you go download it, you'll rapidly see when you load it up spatially that it only covers the lodgement till areas. And the raster components from the lodgement till areas were used to create Sirgo for that same area. And the Sirgo map for Essex County, which of course covers the whole county, actually combines multiple mapping approaches. And about 85% of those approaches were digital soil mapping of either straight up knowledge base, just like I was just telling you about, or some sort of hybrid approaches. And then I think up to probably less, 15% was done traditionally but digitally, probably less than 15%. But you can see on the lower right that's Sirgo draped over the raster survey. So, I'm like I said, I'm just going to touch a tiny bit on Sirgo because really it was the raster side of this that was the first illumination, and that's the big story here. But it is possible to turn a raster into a Sirgo vector product. And as one of the very few offices to have actually gone through doing this, I will touch on it just so you can sort of see. It takes a little bit of processing to get a raster into something that can really realistically be Sirgoized. And the first thing that has to happen is you got to combine some of the raster classes to get logical map units, because just cartographically speaking, you can't have all that spaghetti and stuff happening that you see on the left there. So we did combine classes. We did that based on field data to see which classes were similar to each other. And they weren't so similar that they needed to be combined in the raster product. There were differences, but it's just cartographically speaking, we had to make some calls there. And then the next thing you do is sliver removal, which helps achieve a target minimum size delineation. For Essex County Sirgo, that was 5 acres, and that's a pretty easy and consistent way to do that. And then you end up with a soil map that looks real familiar, in terms of just that product. But I have to say that a significant amount of post-processing is required. After vectorizing, it actually took 2 soil scientists 6 months, so a full FTE, to manually edit the vectors to meet cartographic expectations. And that was after they had already gone through some smoothing. And that is something that has to be done at the very end of the process, otherwise you're going to just waste a bunch of time editing vectors over and over again. So that means that there are no draft vector maps until the entire project is complete. So yes, vectorizing is possible, but we really highly don't recommend doing so. That's a big resource that could be better spent elsewhere. If you have the means to make a really good raster soil map, then all of this is extra at the end that a few people do appreciate. I won't deny that, but it's a lot of work that, just like the beginning data preparation, this part should not be underestimated. So just back to the Essex County raster, to find it, this is where you go. You go to the Geospatial Data Gateway, search for Essex County, Vermont, scroll down to soils data, and there you can see you can download the Sirgo, of course, and then at the bottom is the raster soil survey, and that will give you both the spatial and the tabular data for that. And then there's also a fact sheet and FAQs located on the NRCS Digital Soil Mapping website. I won't click on that, but you can search for NRCS Digital Soil Mapping and it'll come up. Or if I think this PowerPoint is going to be shared, you can click on the link and get to it. And that's all I've got for you today. I'm happy to answer any questions that you've got.
Well, thanks, Jess. You really laid it out really well for people, and we do have some questions in the Q&A, so let's just go right there. And the first one, I know you've answered on a slide, but what percent or how many acres of Essex County were mapped and published with DSM or RSMs? I think you said it was about 85% DSM?
Correct, yeah, 85% DSM, less published raster. I can't remember what the percentage of lodgement till is, but it was the biggest parent material acreage in the county was the lodgement till. So it's quite a bit.
And then another question, are the areas with Sirgo and RSMs congruent concepts that support each other?
Yes, yeah, if you mean the areas that have both Sirgo and raster results, yes. The Sirgo was built directly from the raster, basically. You know, there are some slight conceptual changes just based on how you do that mapping, but yes, the Sirgo was built from the raster, and because of that, you can actually, theoretically anyways, with Essex I think you can really, analyze some of the Sirgo based on the raster. Basically the raster is a component map and the Sirgo is a map unit map. That's one way to look at it. It's not quite that straightforward, but that was sort of the goal.
All right, the next question. In Essex County, where you had Sirgo and RSMs, which came first?
The raster came first, but Sirgo was published first. The whole survey was done in raster format and then converted to Sirgo. And that is how we do it now. Like I said, the vectorizing part has to be done at the end unless you're doing two completely different products, which doesn't make a lot of sense. But the raster can really well inform a vector product.
All right, next question. What DSM products did you create that were useful in the entire survey area, such as slope rasters based on DEMs?
Exactly. Slope rasters, the first thing is the hillshade. We use hillshades to visualize things across the whole county, which is great. The slope rasters we used multiple neighborhoods of. Those were very helpful. The wetness index told us a lot across the whole area, even in places that we weren't doing the actual soil inference. We still use those to drive decisions about wetness. Things like that were useful across the whole area.
Jess, if you could talk for a minute, did this process extend the mapping season for you? In other words, were you able to spread the workload out throughout the year? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's one of the things that we rapidly realized, that it was probably realized before we started. That instead of having a slow season, now we map soils year round. So we spend a lot of time. Most of the actual mapping, since it's done using technology, is done kind of in the winter, and then the summer is spent going out and digging holes. We're able to really target our field work and verify that what we've been doing all winter makes sense, or set ourselves up for the next winter's worth of work.
And another question, what would you do different?
Well, so quite a few things on a minor scale would be done different, just to make things move along a little more smoothly, but we didn't know any better, and we were kind of just figuring this stuff out on our own, so I wouldn't say anything that we did was bad in that respect. But one of the things that I'm working on implementing now is to come up with a better, more consistent way of choosing environmental data layers beyond just me or the other soil scientists sitting there and saying this looks reasonable. We're working on implementing machine learning methods, like a variable importance measure to choose which environmental data layers to use at the beginning of the process. So that would be a major thing that I would do differently. And then at the other end of things, we didn't have a really good accuracy assessment. We didn't have the knowledge or resources to do that at the time. but that has changed, and we've started to really target our work a little differently to set ourselves up for being able to do a better accuracy assessment.
This next one's kind of an unfair question, but did you publish the raster survey to Web Soil Survey, and does anyone run statistics of what users are downloading, raster or vector?
Yeah, we didn't. Web Soil Survey can't take rasters at this point, so there's no way for us to track that. I don't know if you can track the downloads on the gateway. That would be an interesting one to see. You know, I just know from local conversations that people really like the raster, and you know, as soon as the conservationists can use it, I think it will be extremely popular with them. You know, they use it on a ad hoc basis now, just in this office. But yeah, we wish that we could have put it on Web Soil Survey. Again, that's maybe a place that the vectorizing resources could go to, making that capability happen.
Right. So Dave Hoover did put in the chat, yes, we do have data gateway statistics, but just to be clear, the only thing you can get from Web Soil Survey is the vector data.
Correct.
But
yeah, you have to go for gateway.
So a follow-up on the raster product, what did that legend look like? Is it different from the vector survey?
Yes.
The legend?
Let's see. What did the legend look like? Yeah, I don't have it in front of me, but it is different. And so again, the raster was really single component based, and the Sirgo Legend included a bunch of more traditional map units, and then the SIE map units, and you can see that just in the NESIM field. Honestly, the way they were kind of labeled differentiates the type of mapping. But they were tied to, like in Sirgo, they were named, they had map unit type names with 2 or even 3 major components named in the title, whereas in the raster, I don't believe there was a soil series name as part of the legend, because those were single components that spanned more than one series concept.
All right, so you talked about initial survey, but do you have any advice on how things might go differently if you were doing an update project?
Absolutely. That's something that we've been working on. And the idea, this type of DSM anyway, is to glean the knowledge that's already inherent in a soil survey. So Sirgo data has this soil landscape model story already stored in it. And so there's another part of ArcSIE that's called Knowledge Discover, and that helps basically overlay your Sirgo map on top of all these environmental layers and figure out what the central concept was supposed to be for each of those map units beyond what you can read about in the map unit description. And then you can kind of extract that and turn it into rules and remap it. But the idea with that is that you're extracting your central concept from the Sirgo and then kind of narrowing it down and reapplying it across the landscape on a pixel level. So the hope is that the update would end up staying a raster. It would give you just a more detailed soil map. It's not disaggregating, it's narrowing down and applying appropriately.
All right, Jess, and one last question for you. These digital soil mapping techniques seem to always be shown in high relief areas where the breaks are obvious. How does it work in flat areas mapping out Aeolian deposition type soils?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I don't personally have a lot of experience with. But the high relief areas were able to use terrain data really, really well. That's clearly not the case if you're talking about a super flat area. And I think that's where spectral data can really come in handy. And I always, people that come to the SIE class and end up wondering how on earth, they don't have high relief, I say go to the remote sensing class and learn how to work with spectral data, because that is more likely to help you out, I would say. But the other thing is, a lot of times, especially if you get LiDAR data and have super high resolution, there's a lot more variability than you would think, and it's quite possible that patterns can be picked out with some of these environmental data layers. It's just, again, it's not something that I have had to work much with.
Well, thank you, Jess, for your time and effort to make this presentation, and thanks to all the participants for joining in. We had well over 100 people join today's webinar. The on-demand recording will be available on our center's YouTube channel within a few days, so let your colleagues know about this training opportunity. This concludes our webinar presentation.